It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in a control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day, listeners, and welcome once again to the Two Jacks, recording on this day, the 17th of October, year of our Lord 2023. We've got a lot to get through today. Joining me, as usual, is Hong Kong Jack. G'day, mate. How are you?
Excellent.
How are things in Hong Kong? Firstly,
they're pretty good. Nothing dramatic happening here, but I was talking to my son the other day, who now works for the Sydney Swans, and he's been doing some work at the AFLW games, and
yes.
The Sydney Swans AFLW team is splitting their season really between North Sydney Oval, the very pretty North Sydney Oval,
beautiful,
and Henson Park, just to give both sides of the harbour a pretty easy access. And of course, we were having a conversation about how this has led to a return to the old days of suburban footy. And what works for them. And the things that he was telling me about, the things that work is that a nice small oval, not too big, big stadium, and that you can decide to go at the last moment. No one pre-books. You just turn up and pay. And they like to have it in areas where there's lots of bars and restaurants and stuff afterwards, so people can enjoy the game and then go and have a beer and a pizza or whatever, on the way home.
Yes.
Which is
the way it used to be, Jack.
The way footy was when you and I were young chaps in Melbourne. And in fact, we were particular aficionados at Princess Park. You because you were a Carlton fan, and me because it was a 10 or 15 minute walk from home. I was going to ask you, what was your favourite pub to go to after a Princess Park game?
Well, pre-drinking days, Jack, I wasn't going to pubs after the game. What me and a few other mates used to do was run straight at the cameras and get on telly. We were very, very keen to get on television. So we'd spot the cameras and, they'd finish the replay with the crowd running onto the ground, and we'd just run straight at the cameras and big waves and all that sort of stuff and go and watch ourselves on the replay. When we came of age, and perhaps just a couple of years beforehand, we would often head off to the Fenwick or sometimes Norton's, or make our way into town and get the tram into town and have a gargle there.
Well, the Fenwick was my favourite. I'm glad you're running at the cameras. You've always been a bit of a media tart, right back from those days. Yeah, but the Fenwick was my favourite. And in fact, I think you and I bumped into each other unexpectedly there many years ago.
I don't remember it, so it might have been a bit of a messy day, Jack.
Yeah. And the Fenwick's now a block of flats, I think. And that's partly because North Carlton has changed so much. In those days, it was full of still plenty of student houses and young professionals and all that sort of stuff. The young professionals are still there, but they're now 70.
It's a good friend of mine, North Fitzroy. Yeah.
A good friend of mine and a bloke has just moved back into North Carlton, and he was talking on the phone the other day, and he mentioned he'd seen a bloke who we both knew back in the 80s, and this bloke's so old and decrepit he was using a walker to get to his local pub for his afternoon tipple.
There you go.
So it's become a retirement home, sadly.
Consequence of gentrification is people do get old. Now, look, we've got a lot to get through today. Great memories of Princess Park there, but we've got a lot to get through. The Voice referendum has been done and dusted. National vote. Basically, I think they're only about 75% counted at the moment, but the national vote was 40 yes, 60 no, more or less. Not a single state got up. The only exception was the Territory, which doesn't really, is the ACT, which doesn't count in terms of a statehood, of course. So a thorough and rather predictable thumping there, Jack. I just wanted to read one of the comments from one of our listeners. This is a man with a Twitter handle, C. Donners. He said, "Hey, mate, turns out Jack from Hong Kong Jack, got it bang on about the voice. Actually, the result was probably worse than expected for Yes. SA was particularly bad for them." And I said in reply, HK Jack got it right from around February this year. That's when you said it. And I said, mark it down, folks. Jack had pretty much got it right, that this was not going to work. And we'll get into the reasons for that shortly. But an unsurprising result, Jack.
No, it's perhaps slightly worse for Yes than I expected, but something that I think not just me, but quite a few people could see from a long way out.
Yeah, it was the polling was trending towards the high 30s, and I think if anything, there might have been a little bit of a comeback to take it out of that sort of high 30s just into the 40s. Not much of a comeback, it must be said, but that's where the polling was taking us during the polling period before the big day. That the no vote was in the mid to high 30s. So whose fault? Who's to be blamed besides you, Jack, and your dark aspersions on the voice? Who else? Who's to be blamed? I see a lot of anti-Murdoch rhetoric appearing on Twitter, Jack. Wasn't Chris Kenny perhaps one of the loudest proponents of the voice, and to his considerable credit, did so often flying in the face of the audience that he speaks to.
Loud and unrelenting, I would have put it from Chris Kenny. And as you say, full credit to him. I'm always happy to have people stand up for what they believe in and say.
Yes, I agree with that too.
But look, there's a lot of blame going around, and there will be, and a lot of things people could have done differently from the Yes side, but most of them wouldn't have made any difference. The campaign could have been better, and that might have added 2 or 3%, maybe 4% to the Yes side. It could have been bipartisan. That might have added another 2 or 3, but it still would have lost. The problem wasn't with
that's
any
a really
of those
interesting
things.
thing. We'll talk about the campaign in detail in a little while, but you honestly believe that if there was bipartisan support, this still would have failed? I don't think I don't agree with that.
Let me explain. Let me explain why I believe that. And that only one Liberal seat voted yes, despite the fact that only one Liberal seat, only one Liberal seat voted yes. 80% of Labor seats voted no. 80%, including the seats held by Linda Burney, all of the high hitters from the Labor Party. None of them could persuade their Linda Burney, Chris Bowen, Jason Clare, Tony Burke, Ed Husick, Michelle Rowland, Richard Miles, Jim Charlesworth, Amanda Rishworth, Mark Butler and Catherine King, all the most impressive people on the Labor Party front bench. None of them could persuade their own electorates to vote yes. They all voted no. So it wouldn't have mattered what Peter Dutton said, the thing would have failed.
True enough. I think that's right. I mean, look, we'll talk about that too in a minute, but we must say that in Anthony Albanese's seat, that there was a sort of quite strong yes vote, I think, in the 70 percentile. But a number of those seats you're talking about there, Jack, are in Western Sydney, going out to the outer west, where Michelle Rowland, that is. What sort of political consequences are we talking about here? I mean, first thing I would like to say is that all the Teal seats voted significantly in the yes. Are those seats lost forever to the Liberal Party, or lost at least at the next election?
They probably already were. I don't see this having a marked political impact on the two-party preferred vote. because the Liberals' problems with the Teal seats were there before the referendum and will be much the same, perhaps slightly worse afterwards. And I don't think the fact that all of those Labor ministers couldn't persuade their own electorate to vote the way they wanted them to means much either, because the Australian people are pretty able to distinguish between voting in a referendum and voting in an election.
I agree with that.
And so I don't think it'll have much impact on that. Where it might have some impact is on the fortunes of the Prime Minister, because this was a colossal misjudgment of epic proportions. And he had been standing in the party room with a considerable authority after having led them to an election win. And people will now be looking at him saying he's beatable.
Warren Brown's cartoon in the Daily Telegraph, I think on the Monday, yesterday, was basically referring to the $450 million that the referendum cost. Quite a sharp and basically showing elbow, hurling away $450 million. Quite a significant sum. Peter Dutton's position was, he paraphrased Paul Keating by saying this was the referendum Australia didn't need to have. Campaign-wise, Jack, I noticed there are a number of the great and the good involved in that. Lachlan Harris, Tony Nutt, Mark Textor, I've got a fair bit of time for.
So that's from both sides of politics. Lachlan Harris worked for Kevin Rudd, I think, and Tony Nutt and Mark Textor worked for the Howard government in those years. And indeed, Textor and Nutt have also helped out the Conservative Party in the UK. These people are considered the best campaigners, but they didn't do a very good job.
I don't think you could say they did. The impetus of the campaign was to get it all done in the last 3 weeks, 2 of which people were pre-polling or able to pre-poll. And it just seemed that this was the strategy to lead up to a sort of crescendo of support, just on the basis of a 3-week campaign. And I think the point you've made earlier and throughout pretty much since February is that the failure to basically, and we'll disagree about the voice, but the failure to bring people along with the process going back a number of years is the reason why it failed. And the idea that you can turn people around in the last 3 weeks just seems bizarre to me.
The Voice had a 60-40 yes-no campaign lead based on the idea. And frankly, I thought the idea of a voice, even in a constitutional sense, could probably get up. What didn't happen was they consulted with, let's be generous to them and say they consulted with 10 or 15% of the population. The problem with that approach is that you need 100% of the population to be on board. You've got to consult much more widely, and they never did. And that's what killed it, because they came up with a proposal that was never going to succeed. And let's remember, not only did they start with a 60-40 result, they had the support of all the major corporates, all the celebrities, all the major sports organisations, most religious figures, all of the state premiers, nearly all of the state opposition leaders, and most of the media. And it still kept dropping. The more people who read the proposal, the less support it got. There was no great deviation.
How many people did read the proposal, Jack?
Well, the more of them that read it, the worse it went, is the answer.
So you're talking about the proposal put together by Langton and her partner in promoting. That's the one you're talking about.
Langton and Tony Calmer. But not just the big proposal they wrote, but the actual wording of what was going to change in the Constitution. The more people knew about that, the less it was going to succeed. And this started happening over a year ago, and I became convinced it was going to fail before Christmas, because I was talking to some Aussies who are here in Hong Kong, and I just formed the view that these were the sort of people who I absolutely expected to be on the yes camp, and they weren't. And that sort of led me to start to think, well, what's going wrong? And I looked at the polling, and the polling's just been in a straight line all the way through. It's just been falling steadily all the way from.
Well, that's not a straight line. That's
the only deviations from a straight line would fit within what the pollsters call data noise.
But we did have, when this all began, we had support for the voice in the low 60s.
Yeah.
And then we see that decline throughout this year. And going back to last year, we see that decline, and it basically intersects the yes and no support in the polling intersects around about the time that the Liberal Party, Federal Liberal Party, said they were opposed to it. Now that is against trend, but the trend was downwards anyway. But the point of intersection was around about June of this year, if I remember correctly, where the no vote became ascendant.
Yeah, but you were right when you said, I think in February or March, that every time Peter Dutton spoke about the voice, the yes vote went up and the no vote went down. And I think that was a pretty accurate assessment at the time. I still think it's a pretty accurate assessment. I think he had very little impact on this at all. In fact, I think party politics had almost no impact on the referendum outcome.
I tend to agree with that. So when we look at Dutton or Albanese and their prospects going into the next federal election, whenever that will be, you don't think that there's going to be much. I mean, people will dust themselves off and get back on with the business. I think the problem with Albanese lies, and this gets back to this sort of Qantas Qatar business, and one hopes that now he will resolve to resort to cabinet government rather than the captain's picks and the sort of grey areas where he makes announcements and it doesn't go through cabinet. I mean, the Qantas Qatar thing, I know it's a long while ago and that sort of scandal has passed, but if that had been done through cabinet, Jack, not only would cabinet members support it because of cabinet solidarity, but they wouldn't be allowed to talk about it in any great detail because of cabinet confidentiality.
Yeah.
The lesson for him is to stick with the processes that work.
Oh, it is for everybody who's in that job.
That's right.
There was an excellent piece in the Australian at the weekend, on Monday, I think, talking about what had gone wrong, and they were suggesting there was a bit of hubris after the election, and then the historic win in the Aston by-election. And I think he kind of misread the message of the Aston by-election. And there was a refusal. I had this conversation with some yes people saying, look, guys, you just got to slow this down and go back and get the process right. So you got to look at the history of referendums in Australia. Look at 1999. Look at why it failed. Michael Kirby, the distinguished High Court judge, set out 9 reasons why the yes campaign in the Republic referendum failed, and the yes campaign in this referendum replicated 8 of them. But I would talk to people about this, and they would say, "Look, the world's changed since 1999. We're much more progressive post the same-sex marriage plebiscite." So they didn't think they thought they could ignore history. They thought they'd rewritten the way the world works, and they hadn't.
Well, we get back to that bipartisanship there, Jack, and I know you're saying that you don't think it would have changed things very much. Troy Bramston today, I don't know if you've read Troy today, mate. He came forward with an op-ed saying, and this in part, I'll just read it out. Another fairy tale is if Labor legislated the voice, the referendum would have had a better chance of success. Hello, Ken Wyatt twice took the voice to cabinet and was rejected by his coalition colleagues. It never had support in the coalition joint party room, in government or opposition. The coalition would have voted against legislation establishing a voice before a referendum. So the argument that Anthony Albanese needed to work harder to secure bipartisanship is nonsense. The opposition was never going to agree to this referendum, however worded. David Littleproud opposed the question before he even knew what it was, and that's quite true. Peter Dutton seized an opportunity to inflict political damage on the government. Moreover, recognition without a voice is not what Indigenous leaders wanted. So that sort of addresses that. I think those were good points to make. I think bipartisanship would never have come. I know you're saying that it may not, that in your view, would not have mattered, but I don't think anyone could possibly turn around and say, well, had Anthony Albanese consulted further with Peter Dutton, then they might have got bipartisan support. That was never going to happen.
Probably not, because the Liberal Party were opposed to it. But let me say this. They shouldn't have been consulting with Peter Dutton. They should have been consulting with the wider community.
I know exactly what you're going to say, but
Peter Dutton doesn't tell the people of Greenaway how to vote. Well, they won't listen to him if he does, right? That's where it was lost. So pointless to blame Peter Dutton. The blame really goes back to the top for not consulting with the right people, and I think that's a lack of courage.
So who would the right people have been, Jack? They did have the support of the religious communities in Western Sydney, the imams there, Christian senior Christian figures, etc. And as we saw with a fair bit of pomp that there was a unanimity or a comprehensive support for the voice among senior religious figures in the suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne.
Yeah. What they needed to do, what Albanese needed to do, first of all, was to tell the Aboriginal leaders who he was dealing with, I understand this is what you want, but this is not how referendums in Australia work. We need wide support. Now, we need to go to the wider community, perhaps hold a constitutional convention. There are many different ways this could have been done.
Troy Bramston gave that a slapping, that whole idea today in his piece, just saying.
Yeah, not very effective slapping in my view, but he needed to tell the Aboriginal leadership that we need wide support for this to get it through. It's all very well for you to tell me this is what you want. I can't get you what you want without wide support. So that means we've got to go to the wider community and find a proposal that you will accept and they will accept. And that was never done.
All right, Deputy Prime Minister, I think he was interviewed on The Insiders. Was he on The Insiders on the weekend? I didn't watch it.
Yeah, this clip was played on The Insiders, but I think I saw this live to air on counting night.
He said, obviously for those of us who are supporting the Yes campaign, it wasn't the night we hoped for and I am disappointed. But the Australian people always get it right. Or is that white? No, right. And we absolutely accept this result. And what this means is that Australians don't want to see this pursued through a change to the Constitution. Albanese spoke very, very well too, I thought.
Well, can I say why I picked the males thing out?
Tell me.
To emphasise it, is that everybody in politics makes mistakes. Everybody in life makes mistakes. It's just like playing sport. It's what you do next that matters. And that was the right response from males. Don't go around blaming everybody else. Just accept the fact that we put something up that people didn't accept. That's it.
If we veer into Twitter territory, Jack, we see a lot of acrimony on the Sunday and the Saturday night.
Yep.
As the referendum failed, and I was completely taken by Possum Comitatus there, who I know is a Queenslander, and he said, "Why would you think the Conservatives would do anything else than run negative campaigns. They're very, very good at it. And they've been doing it for a very, very long time. So this idea that there was misinfo and disinfo around, I don't know why people were particularly surprised about that.
I did see what he had to say. Just on the misinfo and disinfo, Troy Bramston sort of put in a list of what he called misinformation. All of those, every one of them, were opinions or predictions as to the future. Now, everyone's entitled to their opinion and everyone's entitled to make predictions. It doesn't mean they're right, and no one really knows is the answer. So I don't think it's a misinformation problem. The problem is and was with the process and the proposal.
All right, we just don't want to look at the wisdom of Cos Samaras here, Jack, and then we're going to get on to where we go from here. But Cos Samaras says close to 80% of Labor federal seats voted no. Remove the ACT and Labor Greens contest seats, and that number climbs to 90%. These numbers may get worse with one or two seats, which a line ball in front of the yes vote. The seats of Linda Burney, Chris Bowen, Jason Clare, Tony Burke, Ed Husich, Michelle Rowland, Richard Miles, Jim Chalmers and Amanda Rishworth, Mark Butler and Catherine King all voted no, and that is a fair chunk of the ALP House of Reps talent. So because I think has taken the view that progress, that there is a sort of widening gap between what we might call blue-collar Labor voters and progressives in the inner city, Jack.
And that's been around for 10 or 15 years. I might just say about Cos Samaras, he has done an excellent job right through.
Well, the polling was right, wasn't it? Yeah, the polling was spot on.
Not just his polling was good, but almost everyone got the polls pretty much right. But his social media presence and his explanation of the polls was very, very good. He copped a lot of flack from, he's a lefty himself, he got a lot of flack from colleagues on the left for telling it as it was and refusing to be a simple barracker. So full credit to Cos Samaras.
Well, he did say too that a lot of progressives don't really like the working class, Jack.
So
he's just widening that gap a little bit himself. Yeah, I think there is a disconnect, and it can lead to sort of the nonsense that these people are uneducated, easily led, easily manipulated, all that sort of stuff. Can I simply tell a little personal story here? My eldest daughter's partner is an Indigenous fellow. He's a tradie, grew up in the outer suburbs of Sydney, or really almost regional New South Wales, that far out. His mother is half Aboriginal. And of course, my granddaughter, therefore by extension, is Indigenous. Although you haven't seen a whiter skinned, bluer eyed Indigenous girl for a long time. But I spoke to him about it, and all his family were voting no.
Yeah, this doesn't surprise me in the least.
Now, that's not to say. I mean, probably when we total it all up and the analysis is done, I would say somewhere in the order of 70% of Indigenous Australia voted yes. And I don't intend to sort of say that Indigenous Australia as a whole voted no, but there are clearly other things at work there, and they were to a person going to vote no. This particular family, and I guess their extended family.
Yeah, 40% of Indigenous population in Australia lives in major cities.
Yeah,
Only 17% of the Indigenous population are remote Indigenous people.
Okay, so who comes out of this a winner? Jacinta Price. She looks like she might have had a win.
Well, she comes out of it pretty well in this regard, is that it was a long and tough campaign, and she stood up very well throughout it all. That's not easy to do, and it's not easy to do when you're a relatively inexperienced parliamentarian. She made a couple of mistakes, but she had the good sense just to move on to the next thing without hiding under the down,
apologising.
Yeah. No, she just said, "Well, that's done. That might have been an error."
Obviously, the comment that Aboriginal Australians have benefited from white settlement, European contact, is something that will be with her for some time. But you're right. The worst thing she could have done at that stage was to clarify or back down, and she just kept moving on.
So good performance. I don't think it's going to take her very far. Well, it will guarantee that she's an opposition front bencher.
Yes.
But it won't take her any further than that. So she's a winner. There are very few other winners in this. I don't think Dutton's a winner out of it at all. Elbo's a loser. I don't think his cabinet colleagues are really losers about this, because I suspect that they weren't consulted.
We also have, Jack, where does it leave Warren Mundine? There's a Senate spot coming up. Do you think he'll be?
I think he's already pulled out of that.
Has he? Okay. Yeah, I did not know that.
And I don't think. There's aspects of Warren Mundine that I quite like, and aspects that I don't like, but I just don't think he's an electable politician.
And Jacinta Price, of course, if she wanted to be the leader of the Nationals, or she would need to sit in the House of Representatives, and she's tried to do that in the past. Maybe her popularity has risen, but an analysis of the sorts of people who voted for her said she was basically getting a lot of white votes in Darwin rather than Indigenous votes around the territory.
I just can't see that. I just can't see Jacinta Price being able to make the move to the reps and being a leader or anything. I just don't see it, I'm afraid.
It would be a very problematic move. All right,
but you've got to say she put up a good performance in the campaign. I mean, it was a tough campaign and a long one.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the few benefits of this whole process is that at least we've had a conversation, Jack, as a nation. We've had a conversation about Indigenous disadvantage.
Oh, more than a conversation. I don't think it's going to be possible to be elected to federal government in Australia without promising to do something about remote Indigenous disadvantage. I think people can see the difference. The Indigenous people that are on the drum and Q&A all the time, they're not too worried about them because they're clearly not disadvantaged, but everyone's concerned about remote disadvantage, and I think the electorate will be very unforgiving if a political party says it's too hard, we're not going to try and do something. They'll be forgiving of mistakes. There's a hell of a lot of mistakes have been made in the past, but they won't forgive apathy or inaction.
Well, yeah, I think this could go one or two ways, Jack. And yes, we've had this big conversation about how we handle these things. Firstly, I watched a number of the networks go through, pick through the entrails of the result, and what I saw was half a dozen white people on a panel talking about what's to be done about Indigenous affairs or Indigenous policy in this country. And it just seems to me that we've actually gone a step backwards. I'll go on because there are two things that the coalition is now pushing forward. One is Jacinta Price has said that they want to have an audit of the billions of dollars being spent on programs for Indigenous Australians and closing the gap. That seems to me to be veering off into victim blaming a fair bit. I noticed there was a lot of nonsense on social media about various Indigenous leaders in the country. Noel Pearson, for one, people saying he should be jailed for using for exploiting and misusing funds, and absolutely without any evidence. I worry about that kind of response. Similarly to the coalition has a policy. They ditched the one about having the second referendum. They've gone quiet on that. But the one that really bothers me is that that they plan to hold should they find their way into government, plan to hold a royal commission into child sexual abuse in remote indigenous communities, Jack, and that would seem to be a top piece of victim blaming.
I don't agree with any of their proposals so far. I think and as to whether money's been wasted, all I can say is that a hell of a lot of money's been spent and a hell of a lot of goodwill has been expended on trying to fix this problem without any noticeable effect. That's been going on for 30 years. I think what needs to happen is to have an honest conversation about what the problems are, nothing off the table. And that hasn't really happened. There's been a lot of fudging about what the problems are. And
victim blaming.
Victim blaming. But we need to have we shouldn't be categorising things as victim blaming necessarily. We should be having an honest conversation about what's wrong. One of the things that's blindingly obvious to me, or it seems obvious to me, is that the idea of communal ownership is holding people back. No Aboriginal person in a remote community is going to open a store because of the humbug money problem. Why would you get any richer when you're going to have to share it all?
Let me give you an example, Jack. After the apology, 2008, part of it, one of the reasons Peter Dutton didn't turn up for the apology in the Parliament was that he believed that there was going to be a massive compensation claim arise from the Stolen Generations apology. One of the fixes for that was that Rudd negotiated a $10 billion housing deal, largely to go through the territory. And if you looked at the value for money on that $10 billion spend, going once from the federal sphere, then to the territories and dispersed through housing and education and health and so forth, I reckon you get about 25 cents in the dollar there. So the part of the problem is that you've got, particularly in the territory, where you've got money going through two hands to two governments and almost countless bureaucracies, that by the time the money hits the ground, the rubber hits the road, as they say, you're just not getting the value for the spend.
And then it gets worse from there. So you waste 75% of the money, probably, around about. And then when you build the house, no family owns that house. It's just in communal ownership. So there's no incentive for anybody to look after it. So we need to have an honest conversation about all of these things. They talk about truth-telling. That's where the truth-telling really ought to start. Is let's have truth-telling about what has gone wrong with the remote communities. Let's not victim blame. Let's not say you got this wrong or that got that wrong, because there's been a hell of a lot of people with a lot of goodwill, spent a lot of time up there, mainly progressives, people who I really like, spent a lot of time up there and a lot of money, and it hasn't worked. So we need to be honest about why it hasn't worked and what might work better.
Well, a Royal Commission into child sexual abuse, it actually terrifies me, and the sort of level of hypocrisy from the opposition who didn't support the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. I just wanted to run through the stats.
By the way, I think there are problems of that kind in the remote communities, but they're symptoms, not causes.
They are, exactly right. But I just wanted to go through the crime stats, Jack. First thing I'd say about the territory is get an independent crime statistician. Most of the states around Australia now have them, because it's very difficult to pick through and also have some sort of confidence about the data that you see. NT sexual assault rate is 146.3 per 100,000. That is all sexual assaults, adults and children, etc. It's not all that different from New South Wales, Jack. And in fact, in New South Wales, where we do have a dedicated crime statistician, we are seeing just in recent times a spike in adult victims of sexual assault, a spike in historic child sexual assault reports, and a spike 12.4%, 342 incidents of child victims reporting current sexual assaults. Maybe if we're going to have a Royal Commission, it should be a little bit broader than that. And I wanted to also raise one thing, Jack. Bishop Christopher Saunders, now Bishop Prelate in and around Broome, was the Catholic bishop in Broome for a long time. And I hope you're listening, Bishop, because I'm not sure why you haven't been charged with serious offences. There were $3 million found in 5 bank accounts. There were firearms at the presbytery. There were images of young Aboriginal males naked being stored there. That in itself was a problem. There's evidence indicating that Bishop Saunders was involved in delivering booze into dry communities. This was the subject of a investigation by the Vatican that took 6 months and finished 6 months ago. But yet Bishop Chris Saunders remains in Broome, although not the bishop anymore. I just think we're looking the wrong way often in a lot of these things, Jack. And my real concern is that now we've probably kicked the hell out of enough Aboriginal activists, people like Noel Pearce and Marcia Langton and so forth. They will need to be replaced by younger faces, younger voices. But overall, if I look at the election coverage, or the referendum coverage, I should say, on Saturday night, I saw basically half a dozen white people talking about what Indigenous affairs policy should be. And that seems to me to be a retrograde step, that we've actually moved away from that and we're moving back now into paternalism.
Well, I watched the drum on Sunday, and there were half a dozen white people, but they all identify as Aboriginal, and they were talking about it. And I don't think they're the answer either.
Well, I still think that the voice has been rejected, but we definitely do need to listen to Indigenous Australians on what their needs are. The worst thing that we can do now is start imposing things, because that's what we've always done, and it never has worked. And I think that would be a major problem.
Can I say I agree with that? It needs to start, as I say, with honest conversations. Look, I just think the whole referendum thing was a wasted opportunity. I think a referendum could have been passed, and it wasn't, because they didn't get the process right. On Elbow's head that will hang, but everyone needs to move on. And I think the answer is that the no voters are going to shrug their shoulders and move on straight away. The disappointed yes voters are bitter, and they may exact a political revenge, so it might hurt Dutton more than it hurts Elbow. That's possible, but really everyone needs to grow up and say it's done and dusted. It wasn't even close.
It was closer than the Republic referendum, Jack.
Yes, yeah. Well, that's good.
That was done and dusted about 20 past 6.
The yes campaign didn't win a single electorate in South Australia.
Yeah.
I mean, and you look at the map of all of Australia, and you've got to peer pretty closely to find the ones in blue. I think
the big question for me too is where now? Where now? And if we're going to start, just go back to the age of paternalism, that would be a retrograde step. And if we're going to move into blame shifting or victim blaming and reviews of spending, I would say, by the way, unverified accounts that Warren Mundine, companies that he's been on a board member of, received $303 million in grants over a period of about 7 years, Jack. Now, that's not to say that that's wrong or unethical or anything worse than that. But if we're going to start picking through all of that, I really think where that's going to leave the general public's view is, we're spending too much money on on Indigenous Australians. And
I just think we accept that a hell of a lot of money's been wasted all over the shop. Let's not think about that. Let's think about what we do.
I think any sort of
next.
forensic analysis of this would be a really, really bad thing to do. It will cause all sorts of problems. Moving on, Jack, and across the Tasman, Labor absolutely splattered in the polls. Was it just that they run out of puff, Jack? Probably a bit of that.
I think two things. They went out of puff a little bit, and they'd come up with too many odd ideas. You know, the bit about reducing methane. You know, reducing their livestock numbers dramatically. That was never going to play well in New Zealand. You know, they're very fond of their sheep and cattle.
I think the worst thing about the New Zealand election result is that it has denied us any further leadership from Chris Hipkins, who was absolutely the perfect name for a New Zealand leader. You can actually do it in the Chris Hipkins, and so he's gone. But there's some big issues rather similar to ours, Jack, with discussions now about the Treaty of Waikato.
The co-governance model, they call it in New Zealand, hasn't been a success, in my view.
It's not popular, and well, it's certainly, shall we say, divisive.
Yes. It's something that businesses complain a lot about. And we could learn a little bit about this from Australia. One of the things we could wind back is all the welcome to country stuff and everybody identifying themselves as a proud Walpurgee person, all that sort of stuff. There's nothing wrong with the welcome to country. And I think Peter Layla on Twitter said, we should respect it the same way we respect the national anthem and the Lord's Prayer and all that sort of stuff. And I said, yes, that's right. But we don't say the Lord's Prayer when you jump on a Qantas burner from Melbourne to Sydney, you know.
You don't do it there either, I don't think.
Well, but that's what's happening.
Don't have a welcome to country.
You have an acknowledgement of country, which is much the same thing. So we could just wind those back and
maybe I'll switch off, but I didn't hear that.
We used them sparingly.
Last time I was on a plane, and that was only a few weeks ago. Didn't hear any of that, and I flew Qantas. Look, I think, you know, there's been a bit of there was talk that Telstra had spent $1 million on supporting the Voice, supporting the Yes proposition, and there is a bit of an attack on corporate Australia coming from the right. I'm not quite sure why the Liberal Party would want to be spending their time doing that, given that it's pretty much its constituency, or perhaps it's walking away from that constituency, and we end up with the question of just exactly what is the Liberal Party's constituency, because I actually don't think they know. But back to New Zealand, Jack. In fact, we just want to go through a few stats because there was a 17% swing against Labor. They lost 28 seats. It's a hybrid sort of proportional representation and a similar, I think, sort of first past the post, isn't it, in their seats. So it's a sort of hybrid system, a bit like our Senate and a little bit like our House of Reps, but some massive numbers. And, of course, elected, we haven't even mentioned him here. Congratulations to Christopher Luxon, who is now the New Zealand Prime Minister. It's disappointing that Chris Hipkins won't be anymore because you can't make so many jokes about Christopher Luxon, former CEO of Air New Zealand and a prominent businessman. He has addressed the issue of a referendum around the treaty, and he said that he won't count it out or count it in. He has remarked on this throughout the campaign, saying he thinks it will be a divisive and potentially very unpleasant process for the people of New Zealand to go through. But the ACT Party, which is kind of a far right libertarian party, is continuing to push it, and there is, I think it's sort of 48% support for a referendum, with 45% saying no to the referendum. and the rest I don't know. So it's a bubbling issue. It is one of those social fabric things that could really just rip it apart. I noticed Winston Peters, who may well be a kingmaker again when all the votes are counted, is a sort of supporter of the referendum, Jack.
I don't think it'll happen, to be quite honest.
I think it's that is really not something you want to be doing. And Jacinda Ardern, Jack,
she jumped in time.
She did jump in time. She's very clever, isn't she? I mean, look, she won. Was it 3 elections, and a very successful electoral politician. But by the time she did jump last year, it was looking very, very poor for the Labor Party at that stage.
It was some people would see it as a rat deserting a sinking ship, but she jumped well in time. It's probably easier to get a job at Harvard and the UN and all that sort of stuff when you're a sitting Prime Minister who's just resigned rather than one that's been chucked out.
She has joined Harvard University in a post specialising in technology governance, Jack. Bit of a reminder that I think our government fined Twitter some $600,000 yesterday, I think. Oh, it's actually a little bit bigger than that. But we'll deal with that stuff later, or in fact in another program. But yeah, she's basically she sniffed the wind, hasn't she, and taken the jobs elsewhere.
Yeah. Good luck to her.
Good luck to her, indeed. Okay, housing shortage. And we're going to get to some major events, because the biggest one, of course, in the world at the moment is Gaza. We'll get to that very soon. But there's a housing shortage in the UK. We talk about housing and how significant it's going to be as a political voting determinant. That there's a large body of Australians who feel that they've been counted out of housing, of home ownership. There's another large group of people who have enjoyed the benefits of taxation policy, owning multiple homes, etc. And then there's another group who've pushed themselves to get a deposit together and get a mortgage together. And we're finding this in Germany. The housing shortage is just unbelievable. Rental crisis there, like we've got one here, but it's much, much worse in Germany.
The housing shortage in the UK is getting very serious. They've got a shortage of housing in the prison system.
So it's not about getting a mortgage, and that means that basically judges have been almost told not to put people, not to hand down custodial sentences.
Indeed, this is happening today in the UK. I just had this picture of, remember the wonderful television show Porridge? With Ronnie Barker playing Fletch.
Yes, wonderful.
I just had this picture of Fletch being given his marching orders and told he's got to go home, because there's no longer space for him, and he wouldn't be happy.
Well, Steve Reid, Labor's Shadow Justice Secretary, said prisons were turning criminals away because the Conservatives failed to build the cells they promised. The situation has become so chaotic, he said, that the Conservative government has instructed judges not to lock up dangerous criminals, leaving them to roam the streets and seek out new victims. Is that actually happening, though, Jack? Well, we do know that former Justice Secretary Dominic Raab caused controversy. He wrote to the Lord Chief Justice suggesting that judges should take prison overcrowding into account when passing sentence or deciding whether to remand people in custody.
Yeah, so it was happening as recently as a few days ago. I checked it out on the British papers. I'm just waiting for some enterprising Aussie law firm like Morris Blackburn to head over to the UK and start a class action on behalf of the people who've been denied prison.
Well, there might be some legal action around those who became victims of crime because said criminals were out and about rather than behind bars where they belong.
No, I think you could act on behalf of the prisoners denied prison. Just claim that they were denied the rehabilitation benefits of being banged up.
Yeah, you could put it that way. Very strange situation there. We also get this when you sometimes go through the ACT courts, Jack. You see a lot of blokes there, don't turn up. Then they go and grab them, and then they get bail, and they don't turn up. And when their matters are finally heard and they do turn up, nothing happens. There are no consequences.
Yeah.
And you think, well, they must do. The prisons in the ACT must be chock-a-block. That's my guess anyway. But look, we're moving on to very serious matters now. Israel and Gaza. The ground war, I sort of expected it. What the fuck is this? So it seemed that all the indicators were around a ground war starting perhaps as early as last weekend. That hasn't begun yet, and there may well be that some members of the IDF are a bit concerned about that. But where are we at the moment, Jack? We've got airstrikes into Gaza. We've got populations in Gaza moving to the south. And I think the Egyptians have opened up the Sinai for some of them at least to get out. Of course, electricity, water, internet has been turned off in Gaza. And will this ground war happen? And if so, when? And what's your best guess on that?
Pretty soon. I believe a second carrier group from the US has moved into the Eastern Med. And that's because there is I guess to discourage too much of a wider conflict. The Israelis, I think yesterday, bombed the airports at Aleppo and Damascus, caused a lot of damage at Aleppo because, in their view, the Syrians have been involved in this. Yes. There are some skirmishes on the Lebanese border.
Golan Heights,
the Israelis have evacuated some settlements close to Lebanon in case of incursions from the Hezbollah. And
Hezbollah seems to be, sorry to interrupt, but Hezbollah seems to be taking a wait-and-see approach so far, Jack.
Yeah, as are the Iranians. The Iranian foreign minister went across and had a congratulatory cup of tea with the Hamas leader in Qatar the other day. But since then, the Iranians have been walking back their involvement and saying they're going to wait and see. I suspect that's because they're worried that the Israelis may well extract a price for their involvement. And that would involve some airstrikes on some valuable Iranian property. And the Israelis don't mess about when they do this stuff. If they do it, they generally do it pretty well. So that's where we are. The Israelis are almost certain to go in and try and wipe out the Hamas leadership to prevent this. And I don't see it as revenge so much as trying to prevent all this from happening again.
I was talking to a friend of mine who's a visitor to Israel on numerous occasions, and he was saying that the IDF, that's the Israeli Defence Force, is weaker now than it's ever been, both in terms of numbers and in terms of morale, Jack. And yep. As we discussed last week, going into a land war into heavily reinforced Hamas troops there, it could be a bit of a disaster.
Yeah, I think their morale will have been improved very quickly with this. One of the reasons why the IDF have been so successful by and large is that every member of the IDF knows that they're fighting for their own survival. They're fighting for the survival of their country. It's like the Russians found out with the Ukrainians. They fight much better when they've got that sort of motivation. I mentioned this in a column last week, Jack, and I did notice some of the commenters are entitled to say what they like, but I said that this is actually an existential threat to Israel. Yeah. And people don't see it that way. I mean, I was a bit staggered by that. I can tell you the Israelis do, and Jews around
They
the
most
world
certainly do. Yeah, they most certainly do. We have seen a fair amount of sort of hypocrisy about the place. I did notice that one of the Teals has come forward and said, "Look, I supported the motion in the Parliament condemning Hamas yesterday, and I think there was a bit of mischief made about some of the Teals, at least, about who they came out and first." Jenny Leong from the Greens, she has not backed away at all. Her original comments were made without a proper understanding of the full depravity of the Hamas attacks, and then she's just doubled down ever since. And it's always this kind of nonsense that there is some sort of moral parallel here. We do know, and Media Watch and the ABC touched on this, we don't know if children were beheaded. That hasn't been confirmed. Well, it more or less has been, and I think we're getting hung up on whether swords were used to behead children, when it is most likely that those children were hit with high caliber rounds, headshot with high caliber rounds, and that's going to, with a small child, is going to basically remove their head. I do apologise for that awful image, but that's essentially why we get basically it's kind of perverse. I think that we get into this sort of moral grey area about what Hamas did, on whether they actually physically beheaded children or whether the children were essentially decapitated by gunfire. Why do we get so fixed on these things? Because for me, the obvious response is this is just awful and deserves utter contempt from everyone around the world.
Indeed, yeah. I'm bewildered when I read these sort of windy pieces on social media or in the real media arguing about nothing, really. I mean, if you don't see this as evil, then I think you really need to have a good hard look in the mirror.
Yeah, exactly right. So, Jack, we've got a ground war probably occurring sometime this week. I have noticed too quite a great deal of criticism of Netanyahu from within his own country, largely fixated largely fixed on intelligence failures which led to these Hamas attacks. Is this sort of ground war and the response, is this going to amplify Netanyahu, or will it sort of be the end of his political career? What's your guess?
My guess is that it will follow the usual pattern in Israel when they've had like after the Yom Kippur War, and they've had an intelligence failure. Everyone will put their shoulder to the wheel and get the job done now, but when it's over, there will be a price to pay for the people who've got it wrong, and that would probably include Netanyahu.
And around the world, we're seeing lots of marches in support of Hamas and Palestine.
Just before we leave Israel, I've been getting a lot of social media stuff about people saying, "Well, what do the people in Gaza do?" The response I heard the other day was very good. Well, what you do is, the first thing you can do is hand back unharmed the hostages, and if that doesn't work to stop the bombing, etc., hand back the Hamas leadership, harmed or unharmed, it won't matter, and hand back the terrorists who went across the border, unarmed or harmed, it won't matter. And if you do that, the ground war will stop. And if you say, well, we can't do that, then my answer is, then we've got to the nub of the problem.
Yeah, okay. But, Jack, 50% of the population in Gaza, the Palestinian population in Gaza, are under 18.
Yeah, I know.
So we can't really point a finger of blame at them, can we?
No, I'm not. What I'm saying is that the population of Gaza has it needs to think about getting rid of Hamas.
It's 1 million children, Jack. There's over 1 million children in Gaza. Look, I understand what you're saying, and it may well be the latter part of what you're saying is correct. That the Palestinian Authority in Gaza has no authority over Hamas.
Well, the Palestinian Authority doesn't really exist in Gaza.
Yeah,
when Hamas won the election, they converted or killed the Palestinian Authority people.
Fatah and the other groups that have been around historically are now being sort of eviscerated.
They were wiped out by Hamas.
Yeah. And so what we've got going forward is a Hamas-controlled place, but you've got at the same time over 1 million children.
Yeah, and Hamas does not care.
They don't care. I know they don't care.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to sort of just get around the moral dimension of what's going on here. That 1 million children who, by their nature, don't vote and are completely blameless and innocent, they're the ones who are going to bear the punishment here.
Yeah. Well, no one's voted in Gaza since 2006.
Yeah, but you know what I'm saying, Jack. These are children. These are legally children under the age of 18, and so they can't be blamed for the excesses of Hamas. And they're the ones that are going to be in the firing line.
Yeah, well,
it's a very sad situation. You know that there's going to be a profound military response to what Hamas did, and it will go for weeks and months. And as you said last week, the difficulty will be continuing to support Israel while the incursions occur to Gaza.
Yeah.
It's just an enormously sad situation as far as I'm concerned. Should we be worried about protests in places like Sydney and Melbourne, Jack? I as long as they're peaceful protests, I don't have a problem with it. You know, if they're pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, I don't have a problem.
No, nor do I. And in fact, I think it's I draw the line when people start chanting "Gas the Jews." That's an incitement. That's an incitement to murder, and should be dealt with accordingly. But I think it's a good thing, healthy in a democracy, that people display what they really are. Every now and again, someone turns the lights on really brightly, and we get to see just who people are, like Jenny Leong, and that's a good thing.
Yes, it is. Look, but I just get back to if you are going to peacefully protest, ignore the violent rhetoric. I can't see any reason why pro-Palestinian groups, for example, should be denied the right to peacefully protest in this state or any other.
I think it runs up into problems in some parts of the world when the protests become pro-Hamas protests, because Hamas is, in a good deal of the Western world, a proscribed organisation. So supporting it is an offence.
Is it a terrorist? Is a prescribed terrorist organisation in Australia?
I don't think it is in Australia, but it certainly is in the UK and in the US, I think, and in a good deal of Western Europe. It's a prescribed organisation. So that's a difficulty that those countries need to work out. But generally speaking, I've got no problem with. You're allowed to have dumb ideas. You're allowed to be an idiot.
Yeah, but you can't keep making them. And this is Jenny Leong's business, right? She's doubled down. She didn't understand. She didn't understand the appalling brutality and depravity of the Hamas attacks. Women, children, innocent people being shot to death in their beds, just completely assaulted them. But once she did, she kept doubling down with these false equivalences.
Well, people are now claiming the protests are about protecting the people of Gaza, and that's nonsense, because the pro-Palestinian protests started before a bomb was dropped on Gaza. They were protests in support of what Hamas did.
Meanwhile, Jack, and I mentioned this in my column last Wednesday, Harvard and various groups within it, 30 student organisations co-signed a letter laying all the blame for the atrocities on Israel, and Hamas didn't get a mention. Since then, Jack, when I wrote about it, these 30 student organisations were kept anonymous it was said, to protect them against a backlash. Not much, you're signing an open letter, but you're signing in invisible ink. It's rather silly.
It's typical.
But they've since been outed, a lot of them anyway.
They have, some of there's a billionaire called Bill Ackman, who's a hedge fund billionaire. He said, "Well, I want their names so I can." The CEOs are telling me, "Who are these people? We don't want to employ them."
Yeah, he did. And then there was a response to that from a Harvard Law student who said, "So I know many members had no say in whether their orgs signed either letter. Many weren't even notified that their orgs were considering doing so. No need for this level of harassment." Probably a fair point to make, because these groups, these two open letters as it transpired, but the first one came out really, like the Jenny Leong criticism or denunciation of Israel, came without a proper understanding of what had taken place in Hamas. In Israel by Hamas.
Yeah,
and then they've gone away and doubled down again.
This is particularly amusing as it's Harvard, because Harvard has a dreadful record of cancel culture of its own people who dissent from the orthodoxy. It has the lowest ranking of any university in the United States for freedom of speech. And I think there are nine current Harvard employees who are being pushed out the door because they, as I say, they were for apostasy, for not agreeing with the standard Harvard thought on things. It's almost Maoist in its approach. So it's somewhat amusing that the cancel culture thing has come back around and bitten them.
Well, are people losing their jobs in the United States for criticising Israel?
No, people are losing their jobs in the United States for doing almost anything else, for being apostates on a whole range of progressive causes.
No, but since the Hamas attacks, I mean, the Washington Post tweeted up that the Israel-Gaza war is still in its first week, but some people in the United States and around the world have lost their jobs or have faced discipline or backlash for their criticism of Israel. Now, that's a pretty broad thing, isn't it? I mean, lost their jobs is quite different from backlash, which could just be straight out response. As I wrote about Leong in the Australian.
I haven't seen a single instance of this. Harvard's the one that's come closest, where it looked like people were going to lose their internships and possible employment, but that probably won't happen.
Meanwhile, in New York City, Jack, Mayor Adams, he's managed to be able to sort of cut through the bullshit with an inspired speech at a New York Stands with Israel rally. He began by saying that when an aide, presumably Jewish, said that we are not all right, it hit him, and this is in Mayor Adams' words, in my soul. We are not all right when Hamas believes that they are fighting on behalf of something and their destructive, despicable action they carried out. We are not all right when we still have hostages who have not come home to their families. We are not all right, and we're not going to say we have a stiff upper lip and act like everything is fine. Everything is not fine. Israel has a right to defend itself. Good speech, Jack. It goes on.
Well worth a look. For our readers, you can find it on YouTube. Just Google New York Mayor Adams' speech on Israel, and it's well worth 4 minutes of your time.
Yeah, your fight is our fight. Just to wrap it up, and right here in New York, we have the largest Jewish population outside of Israel. This is the place that our voices must raise and cascade throughout the entire country. We will not be all right until every person accountable for this act is held. Every person responsible for this act is held accountable. Good speech. Check it out. We'll post up the YouTube thing on the Conditional Release Program's website. we've been to the UK. We were returning there again. Large protests, some verging on violence. Lots of threats to Jews. We've seen this a little bit in Australia as well, particularly those of us who keep an eye on neo-Nazi groups, and Melbourne, of course, is the sort of hub of neo-Nazism in this country. There was a group running around. Jack, they were the coppers shot them through to the railway station. Ended up getting off at Altona, but they were really giving people a very, very hard time on the train. Including someone who produced a handkerchief that was the colours of the Israeli flag. And police had to sort of rescue this bloke from copping more than a verbal abuse. And then there was an Arab fellow, Middle Eastern appearance fellow who came onto the train, and he had to be protected by police while these clowns were doing their sick-holes in the train. I am assured from my friends in the White Rose Society that a number of these Nazis, Jack, have dual citizenship. And for the life of me, I cannot understand why people like Peter Dutton and others, and me right now, if you like, are saying, let's get rid of these people. Let's deport them. I mean, that's why you created these laws. Why are neo-Nazis being protected by them?
Just one thing I add to that, the horseshoe effect has taken place again around the world. It's the Communist Party and the Socialist Workers' Party who are involved in this, as well as the neo-Nazis. Yeah. All the nutcases gather in one spot.
Anti-Semitism is the sort of bedrock of extreme left and extreme right politics.
It is. The French, who are always a little bit more hard-headed about this, their French foreign minister has ordered all foreign nationals in his country who commit anti-Semitic acts to be deported, and I think 3 or 4 have already gone. They don't mess about, the frogs.
The French.
Well, I said Le Frogs, didn't I? That's okay if you put the le in front of it.
No.
So, people have that couldn't happen in Australia because it'd have to go through a whole court process. But the French don't mess. The French don't. No,
the minister now has the power, and Dutton referred to this during the anti-Israel rally in Sydney. Referred to anyone who has basically joint citizenship should be deported. Now here we've got. And I've been reliably informed that at least 2 of that Nazi group that are on that railway station, one of them's Irish, hello, do hold dual citizenship. And they should be just deported. Just get rid of them. And it can be done by ministerial discretion. Don't know what's not happening.
Well, I'm not so sure it would stand up. Put it this way, the courts have a long history of getting involved in these things, even when apparently they shouldn't.
But Dutton deported a whole. I mean, it became a bit of an issue between Australia and New Zealand relations about all the Kiwis that were being punted, Jack.
Yeah, but they were punted after a process as well. They weren't just punted on ministerial discretion.
Some of them seemed a bit skinny. All right. The United Nations are pretty much, they're a much maligned organisation, Jack, but they're pretty much the only ones providing humanitarian aid into Gaza as we speak.
Yeah, I think if Israel is sensible, they will make sure the UN WRA is removed from Gaza because it's not an actor in good faith and hasn't been for a very, very long time.
This is the
this is the temporary organisation that was set up to look after refugees in Israel and Palestine after the 1948 war, and it's still there now.
Right. So this is, just to get it right, it's the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine. Yeah. And you're saying that that's a group that has become politicised?
Yeah. Doesn't act in good faith, should be gotten rid of.
How do they handle this, Jack? Because it's, there's a humanitarian disaster just unfolding at the moment, and It really is. We know that there are virtually the moderates are all gone from the entire issue now, be it in Palestine or be it in Israel. I mean, surely there needs to be a way out for those citizens of Gaza. There needs to be a way out. And then, is there any hope that this conflict could lead to some form of workable peace going forward?
It's got a lot to play yet before we can have an opinion about that, I think.
All right. Sport. God, it's a relief to move on to these, to the love of the bat and ball. There's been a bit of a paucity around the world now. Your rugby fans and your cricket fans wouldn't agree, but of course we've come to the end of the seasons in the men's rugby league and Australian rules football. So some of us are a little bit sports starved at the moment, Jack. But I've been watching a fair bit of the World Cup of cricket. You've been catching much of that?
I did. I met a friend to watch a little bit of Australia last night, and a British friend was keen to remind me. He said, "I hope they put the table up, the standings up for the World Cup," because he wanted to see yet again that Australia was on the bottom of the table.
Did he? After England got beaten by Bangladesh? Afghanistan.
Afghanistan. He just wanted to remind me that we were, that in his view that England weren't going really well, but at least we weren't on the bottom of the table. But,
well, you and I were communicating during the India-Pakistan game.
Fabulous match.
Always is. And when you're watching it, you're part of about 2 billion people around the world who are, when these two great cricketing nations and diplomatic foes meet.
It's a reminder, because they play so rarely, it's a reminder of the importance for sports in retaining enough scarcity that if you're playing each other every second week, it becomes boring. But when you play each other as rarely as India and Pakistan does, it's just compelling. You can't not look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's at least 2 billion. There was a list of the largest television audiences in world sport, and cricket comes in at second. Football, soccer, number one, of course, with an audience of 3.5 billion. Cricket's television audience is 2.5 billion, and you will get that when India plays Pakistan. And, of course, you wrote to me saying that Barber was out, and you said that's a big wicket, and I said I don't think there are too many bigger wickets in world cricket.
Not just because he's a great bat, and he certainly is, but he's a very smart cricketer as well. And when he's there, Pakistan's always got a chance.
Yeah. And because he's a great player in not a mediocre side, but he is an outstanding player. That when his wicket falls, there'd be a few heads drop in the dressing room. And of course, India went on to beat them without too much trouble. The Pakistan lost to about 7 for 30, I think, and got to a pretty mediocre 180 odd, and India made them got those runs pretty easily. I saw Australia play South Africa, Jack, and it looked to me like an old side with not a lot of youth in it, and a few blokes in it underdone. I'd say Marcus Stoinis and Zampa would be two there. Just seemed to me they dropped 6 catches, some of them very easy ones, and they just looked like they weren't kind of ready. And I guess this happens in international cricket because they play so much of it. Getting yourself up for one tournament might be a bit difficult, but they really did very well last night against I'm sorry,
but played Sri Lanka last night.
They did play Sri Lanka, of course, so I'm sorry about that. I just went blank. And the fielding was excellent, even though the Sri Lankans put on a good 120 odd for the opening wicket. They really did come hard at them. Zampa bowled beautifully, got his zip back, got that ball, either the top spinner or the wrong and skidding off the wicket and trapping 3 or 4 blokes in front. And the fielding, as I say, was excellent. Dave Warner led the charge there, and then the batsmen all got a few as well. And so their campaign is pretty much underway with 2 losses and now 1 win. India will make it. India will probably win it. They just look head and shoulders the best side in it, and obviously it's at home. So they've got adoring crowds supporting them along, giving them plenty of energy. Who else makes it, Jack? Who makes because you've got a list of 10, and whoever finishes in the top 4, when everyone's played each other once, they go into play in the semi-finals. You got India.
And the SAFAs.
Well, you're only going 2. It's got to be 4. You're going to have 4 semi-finalists.
I actually think that those 2 are a fair way ahead of the park.
I'm not so sure about South Africa. I would put New Zealand in there. They look to be playing very good cricket at the moment. Kane Williamson, their captain and star batsman, having some injury problems. I think that might affect them, how they're going on. They absolutely made mincemeat of England. Some very talented players there. Probably a bowler short, but New Zealand are a wonderful cricketing nation that they seem to regard the sort of on paper deficiencies as just a challenge. So I'd put them in there. South Africa possibly, because have we noticed that there's someone missing from the 10, Jack?
Australia and England.
No. In the 10 competing sides.
Who is missing?
West Indies. Yeah. Isn't that sad? I regard that as sad because Netherlands will got them in. They because of their previous results, they had to. The West Indies had to qualify and failed to do so. So India look head and shoulders there, Jack. And of course, then we've had the World Cup of rugby. And if you had have asked me who was going to win the 4 games over the weekend, I wouldn't have got one right. I would have tipped against England out of general malice. But everyone else, I thought Ireland would get through. I thought the French would get through against very good opposition, both sides. And then I probably wouldn't have gone the Argentinans, I should say, over Wales. Terrific results.
The two quarterfinals in Paris, Ireland and the All Blacks and South Africa and France were absolutely cracking matches. They were both rugby at its very
high scoring first halves,
and either of those 2 matches would have been a fitting final. The matches in Marseille were not quite as good, but entertaining nevertheless.
Fantastic effort from Argentina to qualify into the semis. Fantastic effort.
Yeah, I'd like to see Argentina go all the way and win it, just because I'd like to see a new country with their name on the trophy.
Well, we did, yeah, absolutely. I doubt that they will, but they played Wales, and Wales, their form hasn't been wonderful. I mean, Ireland are ranked number 1 in the world. They got beaten by the ABs. France, the favourite to win the tournament, got rolled by the SAFAs, and then England. Well, you wouldn't say they fell in, but they had a fairly close contest against Fiji, who've had a wonderful tournament too.
They did. I was WhatsApping with a friend who's over in Marseille for the quarterfinals over there, and you'd enjoy this, Jack. He had good seats and went for drinks with the English team afterwards, and he found himself having beers with Mike Tyndall and Alan Lamb, the former
English cricketer from South Africa,
who spent 25 minutes telling him about the last over 18 he scored at the SCG.
Bruce Reid bowling.
Yeah, Bruce
Reid
Reid bowling.
bowler too, Bruce Reid.
So my pal thought that was a pretty good night, topped off by a dance with Zara Tyndall.
Oh, very, very nice. Yeah. Meanwhile, a couple of my mates, one fresh from the earthquake in Morocco, and a couple of his mates. They met in Paris to watch the Wallabies play Fiji. And I said, "When did you leave?" He said, well, I got two different versions. One from one guy said, "Oh, we were gone with 10 minutes to go." And my good mate James, he reckons 5 minutes, but I don't believe him. I reckon he was out the door with about 10 minutes to go. They'd had enough. They'd had a gutful. So who wins, Jack? You'd like to see Argentina, but who don't?
I would, but I don't think it will
be.
I think it'll be the SAFAs.
Yeah, me too. All right. Well, that takes us out. We've had a very big, long program dealing with the voice, of course, and dissecting the results there and where we go now as a nation into reconciliation, where reconciliation goes from here. So we've taken up a lot of time with the recording. With recording about those two main issues. We'll be back next week. We've got a few things on the boil, Jack, including there's been an epidemiologist report from Sweden, Jack, that doesn't paint a good picture of their pandemic response. I'll send that to you during the week so we can have a good natter about that. And we'll be dealing with other matters in other, perhaps less reportable parts of the world at the moment, including Africa, and a fertiliser shortage, which is really causing mayhem in their agricultural industries and delivering food to tables in the continent. But thanks very much for your time today, mate. And I really do appreciate your analysis on the voice. It is quite true that you were absolutely spot on about this from, at least from February, and maybe a little bit earlier than that.
Not that it gives me any great. I mean, if you're tipping, you're always slightly afraid you'll look more of a fool than usual if you get it wrong. But it doesn't give me any great pleasure to be right about that. I just think it's a wasted opportunity. Just before we go, two things from a progressive friend. The sad thing is that even if you're too shamed to live in Australia these days, you can't even move to New Zealand. And secondly, a little bit of news from Africa. There's a chap in Kenya who managed to get into the Kenyan Law Society website and log in as a fellow of the same name, who was a lawyer, and put up his own photos on this, and then went and practiced as a lawyer, despite having no qualifications to do so. This was eventually found out, and the chap's been arrested. But meanwhile, he's conducted 26 cases as a fake lawyer, and he won all 26.
There you go. What's the use in studying, Jack? You just say you're a lawyer and you'll have the sort of grit to get the job done. Yes, very, very good indeed. So, look, that's all to be. We've got a number of things on the agenda for next week, and we look forward to bringing that to you. And as usual, we do encourage you to drop us a line and let us know whether we got things right, wrong, whatever. And you can get hold of me at Jack the Insider on Twitter. My DMs are always open, and you can get hold of Hong Kong Jack on his Substack. Give it to me, Jack.
HongKongJack.substack.com.
There you go. All right. Thanks, listeners, and we'll be back with the two Jacks next week.